Sounds good. So, shall we start with the network policy
Yep.
to GA stuff?
I assume Winship added that, perhaps.
I added that. This is
Okay.
Tim.
All right. Hey, Tim.
Yeah, so for those, I don't know, I haven't been here for the last couple of meetings. So for those who missed it, I couldn't get enough bandwidth to review it in time, and so it missed the window for GA for 1.6. 1.7 I think seems like a shoe-in. All we got to do is, put the and cross the T's. So one thing that came to light late was that it looks like most of the implementations don't actually support named ports yet. And so we need to get some feedback as to whether that was just oops, or whether there's a reason that that's not supported. Like, should it be stricken from the API? Or should it be supported named ports are supported in most places throughout the API. So we should figure out if we need to fix that or what. Thoughts from implementers?
It's hard.
Name ports are they associated with the service or the pod?
The named port is the port on the pod.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it will be a pain for us to implement, but a lot of other things have been a pain for us to implement too. So if everyone else wanted it, we could do it, but.
Well, I don't like making pain, and my only real concern is that services and ingress both support named ports, and most implementations support that for those. So it would be a little weird for this not to support.
So the difficulty is that you can't just write a rule. Well, if the port is like always port 80, then you can just write a rule that says port 80. And if the port varies by pod, then you need a whole extra level of mechanism. I agree with what Dan said. It's doable.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all of that. I'll say it's not impossible. It was kind of an oops thing for us that it was missed, and then we held off because we hadn't heard from any user who had ever used that or wanted to use it.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is I think it's very seldom used, and part of me wishes we had just stuck our guns and removed it, because we actually tried to remove it at some point, and we got some pushback from people who had some active use cases at the time. I think at the time the use case was etcd was renumbering its ports, and people were doing live updates using named ports, and it was sort of a cool trick that it could do that we could have a service stay alive across that. I don't know how frequently it is used. Like I said, I think it would be weird to be the only place where it doesn't support it, but if the general consensus is to remove it and see if anybody complains, we could do that.
Because it wouldn't break the JSON API, at least, to add it back in later. I don't know how protocol buffers work, if we can change an int to an int or string.
Yeah, I have no idea how interstring is encoded in protobuf. That's a great question. Yeah, so the question is, would it be compatible later? Like, could we add port names back? And the idea that the fact that it was into a string in the first place probably was also a mistake, but it's a mistake that has been carried through in a couple different places. So V2, one day we'll do a V2, right? I'm fine with striking it if we can get to an answer as to whether it would be forward compatible later.
Okay, I can look into that, I guess.
Okay.
If it turns out switching from int to int or string isn't forward compatible, would we want to leave it as int or string, but say you're not allowed to use strings in V1?
Let's cross that bridge when we get there.
Okay.
I'm okay with potentially striking it entirely. I'm still of half a mind to try to remove named ports throughout the whole system. It is complicated to implement. As someone who had to implement the service controller for it, it is complicated. But it is sort of cute. Okay, so Daniel, figure that out, and then we'll figure out if we want to abandon it as part of that same PR.
Yep.
Okay. Allow to all TCP but not UDP ports and vice versa. I did not add that one. Who added that one?
I added that. So that's another weird thing in there. So you can specify a port and give a protocol, but not a number. And then that means to allow to all ports of that protocol, regardless of port number, which seems really like something somebody added just because it was theoretically possible, not because anyone would ever actually want to do it. And I'm pretty sure nobody implements that as well, because if you're not reading carefully, you wouldn't even notice that the feature is there.
Interesting. It seems like a natural fallout of the schema. Is it complicated to implement, or is it just just something that people probably didn't think about?
I'm pretty sure that Calico implements this, but I think it, again, it's just a natural fallout of the schema and how it relates to Calico.
It wouldn't be hard for us to implement. So we can keep that, especially if Calico already does it.
Yeah, I mean, that one seems more natural to me than the named ports. I would move to keep that, and we should put it in part of our testing.
And so those are the only two features that I knew of, but
Okay.
I wasn't sure if maybe other people remembered either not implementing something or leaving a fix me implement later anywhere. I think those are the only two that OpenShift is currently not implementing.
Okay. So the next topic was back to the null versus empty list. We had decided that we would keep it the way it was in beta and not distinguish between null and empty list, right?
Yes.
And that either null or empty list meant don't care, right?
So that's
Right.
a change from our documentation, right?
Yes, the documentation captured our intended state, but in beta we couldn't implement it because the code generators were broken, and then I think we mostly decided to just leave it the way it was in beta.
And nobody implemented it the way that it was documented as, because if you tried to create a network policy via JSON and then tried to specify an empty list, it would just get turned into null.
Yeah, right, because the marshallers and whatever were all broken. So a slight update on this. The marshallers are still mostly broken, but this topic has come up in other facets of the API, and some are insisting that it is fixable and that they want to try to fix it because for them, they think the distinction matters. I think we were just being lazy mostly, right?
No, I think my recollection is I argued for this distinction because I do think it matters. Again, my argument was a human can cope with this, but if you think about this stuff being generated by some higher level system, it's an irregularity.
Yes, I agree. It is irregular. The question was whether it was worth the energy to fix the irregularity, right?
Right. And
So that was me being lazy.
okay.
And so then the question, I guess, that comes right back is, should we leave this as an open question to see if Clayton and Jordan and crew can actually fix the code generators to handle this properly, or if they're going to come to the same conclusion we did?
Well, so the other thing going into it is that nobody, other than it's more natural for auto-generated stuff, nobody actually wanted the semantic of treating them differently, because the empty list semantic was equivalent to just not having any rule at all, because it blocks all traffic.
Yeah, it's not really useful, but it is regular.
Right.
Is there any hope that they would fix the generation by 1.7?
Well, I mean, Clayton insists that it is doable. I tried and eventually just gave up. I felt like there were too corner cases.
Well, there's only one Clayton. How much time can you devote to it?
Yes, but Jordan and David think that it's worthwhile for them to look into it. So I would suggest that we we should proceed as we are with erasing the distinction. And then if they actually do fix it before, say, 2/3 of the way through the next cycle, then we could consider adopting the more regular semantic. And that way we're ready for GA either way. And if we get the sort of pure way, then we can do it the pure way. And if not, then we're fine. Disagreements?
Did I capture that accurately in the agenda doc?
Yes.
Okay.
I would not, to be very clear, I would not suggest holding the PR for that.
If we're going to plan right now to keep the change, we should change the documentation. We should fix the documentation to describe the way it's actually working now.
That is also true.
The PR updates at least the API documentation. We need a whole bunch of stuff for documentation.
Yeah.
But that's mentioned in the PR at least.
Which PR are we talking about?
I believe it's the one linked at the bottom there, 39164. Yes.
Okay, so assuming that, then as soon as the merge window reopens for 1.7, I will get that PR and we can hopefully get it off very soon.
Okay, the other question that I just added to the end of the list there, one of the open questions was, are we still in package API extensions now that it's supported? I wasn't exactly sure what extensions is supposed to mean.
Oh, yeah, right. No, we need to move it to a separate API group. Oh, we didn't start that, did we? We'll have to create an API group. I think there isn't one yet for network. And we'll have to do that. And it's a little tedious still, but I think that's the right thing to do.
Okay. Can you point to an example of someone having done that in the past so I can look at?
Yes, absolutely. I will have to find that PR. I'll take a note to go find that.
Okay.
So is that it for network policy?
Sorry, I had one more. I was just sending myself a note.
Sorry, go ahead.
The last one was
Cross namespace pod selection.
oh yes. So we currently spec it as a pod selector or a namespace selector. It has come up in the taints and tolerations API that they have a different problem, different semantic that they chose. And I suggested to David Oppenheimer that we reconcile if we can, since both of us are pre-GA, but we're a little further along than they are. Well, actually, I guess they're going beta in 1.6, so we're equal now. And their semantic is they have a list of namespace names and a pod selector. So you can select pods from a different namespace. And we sort of tried to stay away from that extra level of complexity. Anyway, I wanted to put it out here to see what people thought about that.
So in doing demos and talks about the code and trying to provide sample network policies, it really confuses people that one of the pod selectors refers, or that one of the pod selectors affects traffic from all namespaces, but the other one only refers to traffic within a single namespace, just because of how the semantics end up working. Like the destination pod selector affects incoming traffic from other namespaces, but the source pod selector only selects the current namespace. So maybe I'm not explaining that well, but the current semantics do seem to be confusing people, and it's possible that this would help that.
Okay.
Did you mean to say label selector, not pod selector?
Well, a selector of pods by labels. Labels are the mechanism, right?
The field is called pod selector. Its contents are a label selector.
Right, and in both cases, the pod selector applies to pods in.
So So it may be badly worded examples, but the examples were like have an allow from red pods policy and an allow to red pods policy. And if you implement those in the obvious ways, one of them only affects traffic within the current namespace, but the other one affects traffic from all namespaces.
So let me see if I got it right. So the idea is the one that selects the subjects of the name of the network policy selects the subject and applies the whole policy, even if that policy is about traffic from outside the namespace. Whereas the one that is selecting peers can only select peers in the same namespace.
Right. And I don't actually know if this alternate version would actually make that
Wait,
clear.
I'm not sure that's right, if I understood correctly. It's not a distinction between the two pod selectors. It's between the pod selector and the namespace selector, right? So both pod selectors only select pods in the same namespace.
Right, but when the destination pod selector applies to traffic coming from outside the namespace, whereas the source pod selector only describes traffic within the names. It's maybe if I write it up and send email.
Yeah, I think I
Is that
got it.
actually what the spec says?
I think you understand network policy too well to be getting confused by this. But
Yeah, I never found it a problem.
So I had to explain it to somebody this week, and their question was, if I use the namespace selector, but I don't want everything in that other namespace, why doesn't the pod selector also apply, right? Which is, I think, the natural question to ask, right?
And I seem to recall that we had these conversations a while back, but we decided that since there was no other example of cross namespace selection, that we were going to postpone discussion on that or not make it part of the V1 spec.
Right. I recall that decision too. And so I think we are now starting to revisit, since we now have at least one other example. Why don't we do this? I'll take the action to, this came up just yesterday, so I didn't have time to prep it, but what if I get David Oppenheimer from the scheduling side to join us here in 2 weeks? And then we can hash it out as one of the main topics. Because I'm a little bit loath to make changes between now and GAing it. But I'd like to make sure that, you know, we at least have a path towards alignment, or that we decide explicitly that we don't care.
Will we be meeting in 2 weeks?
That's a good question. I assumed so, but what's in 2 weeks?
Well, in past, haven't we taken a hiatus after KubeCon?
Oh, that's true. I mean, we could do 4/6 would be 2 weeks. So 2 weeks after that would be 4/20.
are there going to be lots of network people at KubeCon?
Yeah, there's even a special meeting.
I, alas, will not be there, but if you guys want to talk things through, I have no objections to that.
Well, look, I'm not objecting to meeting in 2 weeks. I'm happy to meet in 2 weeks. I just thought I'd bring it up because it's different from the past.
Yeah. The problem then is 2 weeks after that is DockerCon, was the last day of DockerCon. So at least I will be on a plane at this time, 4 weeks from now.
So let's plan a meeting in 2 weeks then.
That sounds good to me.
Okay. Of the group here, how many people are going to KubeCon EU?
I'll be there.
Most of you have video off. I guess that was a bad survey.
Me.
So that's 3 people.
Okay.
Or we're doing it in chat.
All right. Well, I will not be there, but Michael Rubin will be there as my delegate. So find him and give him a hard time.
And does everyone know when the meeting is 4 p.m. on the Tuesday?
So never mind.
That's right, 4 p.m. on Tuesday of KubeCon?
I'll go look up the details more accurately.
Yeah, I would like to send it to Michael so he can crash.
Yeah, it's noted in that spreadsheet for the groups.
Yeah, I think that's right. I sent an email around, so it should be on the list.
is alas not in our meeting notes. Oh, there it is. Wait. It says, double check with event folks to see if the later slot is booked before canceling the earlier slot. That was on Casey.
We did that.
Yeah, and we did that.
And which direction did it end up?
Later.
It ended up being 4 to 6.
4 to 6? All right.
In the interest of time, should we just continue discussion of that on the mailing list?
Yes, let's take that to the mailing list, and I'll see if I can get David here in 2 weeks.
Okay. All right, if there's nothing more for network policy, let's jump into IPv6. Are either of the two people mentioned on the call?
Yeah, hi, this is, I'm Rob Pothier. I'm part of the team at Cisco. We've been looking at trying to help out in the IPv6 area. And so we had a few questions, and the first questions here is just how we handle the controller manager inputting the cluster CIDR. Right now, there's just a cluster CIDR option where you can put in your CIDR, but would we have to add another option like a v6 CIDR? For dual stack, for single stack,
Yeah.
if we only support one, we could just use the one option. But I guess the question is, if we're going to support dual stack, will we need two options?
Yep, I think we would probably want to change. Where is cluster CIDR stored? Which object? It's on. Oh, it's just a flag to controller manager,
Yeah,
right?
I don't think it's stored anywhere.
Okay.
So, can somebody refresh my memory? Cluster CIDR, I mean, it's used for a whole bunch of things, but is that what node CIDRs actually get allocated out of if node CIDR allocation is turned on?
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. Node CIDR allocation will chop that up. So I should say one of our guys in Poland, Wojtek, who's doing all our scalability work, is also looking at breaking the need for there to be a single contiguous cluster CIDR because that doesn't fit well with ever-growing clusters. And so maybe in the 1.7 cycle that will be changed, maybe if we're lucky.
So the other thing that struck me about this is that depending on the network plugin may not need that kind of allocation scheme. It seems like allocate node CIDRs is good for some of the cloud providers as well as KubeNet, but a lot of network plugins may not even allocate CIDRs to a node like this, especially for v6.
Yeah, I agree. This is part of why I think it needs to just go away. I think that it was a mistake to do it that way. So I think we're going to be moving away from it, but it exists for now.
So there is another value which some people end up setting the same, which is passed to kube proxy to masquerade everything in and out of the cluster. And I always find that very hard to explain to people why there are two values that are supplied to two different components. It's not stored anywhere. It's not accessible through any API. It's just a thing that you better get right.
I agree. So keeping in my vein of there's things that people are working on, there's this dynamic config proposal that has started with kubelet configs, but will eventually expand to cluster configs, which would be the obvious place to stick such a variable. Except I don't want there to be such a variable. I want to find the places that assume that it is one contiguous block and break those.
Well, yeah, but that's two orthogonal things. I think if you put the configuration, including multiple discontiguous blocks, in the API, then add-on networks can read that and do the best they can with it.
Right. Yes. So by the time we get to the dynamic config, I would like it to be not a singleton. It would be a plural, and people would have to consume it as a plural.
Can we do the same?
Sorry.
Can we do the same for? Can we do the same for the service IP CIDR as well?
I don't see why we couldn't. I don't think that was part of the scope that Wojtek was looking at, but I don't think that would be out of bounds.
Hey, Dan,
I would go further.
have we had, I know we've talked about this internally for OpenShift as well. Was that on the service side or was that on the cluster side? For multiple segments?
Allowing multiples?
Yeah.
I think we talked about it for both. For the case of renumbering your network, being able to have two live, discontinuous subnets at the same time would make things a lot easier.
Okay.
So we were looking at it from a cluster and from a node point of view, so that your node could be assigned multiple disjoint CIDRs. I hadn't thought about it for service. Sorry, Dan, you said?
I said same here for us.
And then I think Mike said something back, but we stepped on him.
Yeah, I was just saying that as far as I can tell, at least when I looked at this a few months ago, maybe more than a few, the service CIDR wasn't really necessarily used for anything. At least in the case I was looking at the time, when the client would always supply the service IP addresses, the service CIDR was just a check that was going to get in my way.
Well, in the default cases, it is used to allocate cluster IPs, right? If you don't ever, you don't have to worry about it. Is it used anywhere else? I think it was considered, but not currently used as part of the kube proxy, like an optimization. But I don't think that it's currently in use. I don't think that's checked in.
Yeah, it occurs to me that if you're replacing a lot of the ingress with your own load balancer and other stuff, you probably don't care that much about the service CIDR.
Okay, so I lost track of the...
Does that answer any of the questions that you had?
Yeah, regarding V6, I think that it like for the medium term, it has to become a plural.
Yeah.
It'll have to be a new flag that is pluralized, and we may want to think about whether it needs to be a little bit more structured than simply a list.
Yep.
Or maybe we spec it as just a list of, it can have up to 2 CIDRs, one V6 and one V4, or maybe we just add a second flag that is the V6 CIDR, like the original suggestion, I guess.
Just to confirm, Tim, for Google's uses, you guys would still want there to be some kind of controller managed allocation for the nodes, basically just transposing what KubeNet currently does to V6, or would you mention different semantics there?
That's a great question. I actually plead ignorance on like the way things are typically done with V6.
Yeah, I meant more like, for example, with OpenShift, we don't use any of the allocate node CIDR stuff because we have our own mechanism for doing node allocation for the nodes, both the pods and node addresses. And so, it's not really useful to us, and I can imagine it's probably not useful to other plugin writers as well, but yet it is useful to the cloud providers that happen to use KubeNet.
Well, I'm also hoping that KubeNet dies a violent death soon.
Right.
But the question remains of, if somebody were doing V6 even with KubeNet, is the normal, is it the done thing with V6 to just randomly allocate blocks per machine, or is there some auto calculation that is done there? I seem to recall some standard stuff that was different than V4 because of the wide space.
Yeah, typically, I'm a little fuzzy on how that works. Typically, it's prefix delegation to a node, and so that's essentially what allocate node CIDRs is already doing. Usually when you assign an IPv6 address to an interface, it always gets a /64. So you would typically have larger than a /64 allocated to each node, and then it would allocate addresses out of that larger slash.
But is the /64 allocated centrally, or is it something that can be sort of autonomously decided?
You would add. excuse me.
It can't be decided by itself, but you may have other infrastructure for automatically assigning them, like DHCP prefix delegation or something like that.
So, I mean, for example, you could allocate a /56 to every node, and then that node assigns addresses to the pods, and those pods get like a /64 or something like that. Or, I mean, if you don't want to go that route, if you actually do routing between the pods and not relying on any of the link local type stuff or subnet stuff, then you could assign. What's the term? Anyway, yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. Why are we talking about a /64 for each pod?
For each node.
For each node.
Okay, well, /64 for a node I can understand. Why? So why did you say /56 for a node?
Sorry, I'm getting a little confused with some other uses of prefix delegation.
Yeah, for prefix delegation, you'd usually start with a big hunk of /56, and then every node would get a /64.
Yep.
And then the pods would get a single address from that /64.
So I think to answer your original question, the simplest path would probably be to add a second flag that did this. But as the folks who are doing the implementation, if you think that that's not the right thing to do, if there's a more V6 pure way to do it, I'm totally open.
I think the second flag is just would be good enough to get this going.
Okay.
So moving on from that, once you actually have /64s or whatever delegated to the nodes, we then need to make sure IPv6 gets through all the rest of the Kube API, which I tried to add some other notes down below. Specifically multiple pod IP addresses, and some of the CNI related items as well. I mean, I guess just going over some of those, currently pods can only handle one IP address at a time in the API, so the pod status only has space for one. I think there are various proposals floating around out there for that. And actually, I think the multi-network proposal that Joji put together and that we've all been commenting on touches on this as well, because his proposal proposes to add some fields to the pod status structure.
Right.
Yeah, I think we have to support at least link local and one other IPv6 address, and but you probably wouldn't be using the link local for anything. And then the next question is, would you want the API to be able to display that link local, or do you just leave it kind of hidden and just use the address that's assigned?
That is a good question. Can anybody think of uses for the link local address outside of the pod network itself?
I think it's too local. It's to use it for anything.
Just for the router, basically, right? That link local IP address.
Is there any use case for things like local health checks where we would want to talk link local instead of standard regular IP?
There might be, but
yeah,
you'd probably still have the link local address segregated if we're talking about tenancy as well.
Exactly. Yeah, you cannot count on it.
So, like, I mean, I assume you're talking about the node side, Tim. Like, for example, if the node wanted to do a health check by just talking directly to the pod's link local address, that may not be possible.
Okay, then if we can't really assume it, then probably it's not really that useful.
Well, maybe for the moment, we focus on actually getting multiple pod IP addresses into the API, and then we can decide what we actually put into that array. So for the rest of the stuff there's various CNI.
So, hey guys, can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yep. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So it's a bit of a wacky corner case hackish thing, but I'll just mention it here. We have some folks using the link local V6. Sorry, let me back up. we have a way to bring up a link local v6 address on a pod, and we have at least one user using that to reach out to dual stacked endpoints out of the cluster. We basically do a NAT off host. And maybe I'm not describing it perfectly here because I'm not so familiar with it, but I just wanted to bring it up that we have a variation of our CNI that will bring up a v6 link local address. Again, it gets natted off the host to reach out to dual stacked endpoints. So I'm not sure how relevant that is to the question, but it's just something that we've sort of stumbled into.
So it has a link local address, but no globally routable IPv6 address?
Correct.
So it still only has one address. So it's just that it's a link local address instead of a global one. So that seems like
it has a V4. It has a V4. It has its normal V4 address. It has its normal V4 address plus a link local.
Which direction is the connection being opened using this address? Is the pod opening the connection to outside, or outside opening a connection into the pod?
I'd have to think it through again. It's been a while since I looked into it. It's reaching out to dual stacked. The pod is reaching out to dual stacked endpoints.
So if the pod is using that address to open a connection to something else, that'll work even if we don't honor it by noting that address in the API, right?
Yeah, it should, as long as you do the NAT correctly.
Not sure what.
I'm not sure how big of an issue it is because I think it was sort of a temporary thing, but
temporary meaning if they once they get like EULAs or global addresses, they probably wouldn't use the link local, right?
Correct. It's a stopgap to support to just access v6 endpoints.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Do you mean stopgap in development time or stopgap in runtime?
In development time. There's no v6 support in sight, so they just needed to hack something together that shouldn't survive. Let me just put it that way. I don't want to dwell on it, but I just bring it up as a point of a use case.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so there's various CNI stuff. Are any of these PRs active? Anybody on the call working on the CNI PRs for IPv6? I know some of that was put on hold for the the interface changes in 0.3.0, but I think that now that those have gone live, we can probably restart some of these PRs and ideally get them rebased on top of current master for CNI, and then keep pushing it forward.
Yeah, I have two PRs out. One for the bridge plugin and one for MAC address creation. But it's dependent on that PR that's been out for a while that needs to be rebased. I don't know if anyone's actively working on it, or you need someone to pick that up.
Yeah, maybe just ping on that issue, and if nobody replies for that one, then feel free to pick it up. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one thing we wanted to make sure that is well understood is that this /64 boundary that we're kind of assuming that in CNI that there will be 64 bits available for the interface identifier, and that means that the subnets have to be limited to no larger than a /64 subnet space, or conversely, the prefix length is less than 64 bits. So it's a little different thinking than IPv4, but we think that's a reasonable boundary, and the host local plugin should probably check that and enforce that.
That said, though, the interface identifier requiring that much space is usually useful for the link local. But if we're doing assignment from a different address space, is it as useful to require that 64? Or can we just do the allocation and perhaps... Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the question.
Yeah, if we ever get into Slack Slack address generation, then we're going to need the 64 bits. And there's other v6 features like v4 to v6 translation that rely on the 64-bit interface identifier. So there was a discussion, I think it's pointed to on one of the items here. But
I guess I was thinking more along the lines of, yeah, if we were going to do Slack and have some kind of advertisements or whatever, then yes, it would need the 64 bits. But if you follow the general current model with the host local plugin, where it basically generates and allocates those in a kind of a round robin fashion, then we don't necessarily need the interface identifier for the interface, right, for constructing the address from a prefix.
Yeah, I think we're limiting ourselves if we don't reserve that 64. But there was a discussion on one of the CNI pull requests.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate any input on that. That's I have one way of thinking, but I'm sure other people.
Okay. I guess let's maybe move the discussion on this over to the CNI issues and try to follow up there, and then KubeNet.
Yeah.
Whatever
Appreciate that. Yeah.
Rely on that. Anything kube proxy? Is anybody working on IPv6 actually care about kube proxy at this point?
Not until we get the pod addresses working.
Fair enough. Okay, last thing, I guess, then cloud providers. Do any of them actually care about IPv6? I feel like we've seen most of the push for IPv6 not come from Google or Amazon.
So apparently Amazon has v6 support now, but it's very, very limited. Google's does not, and as far as I know, that is not something that's landing anytime soon.
Okay, that answers that question. All right, with our short time DNS per namespace.
Yeah, Mike, I don't know if you want to start off the discussion with some of the updates that we talked about.
Well, I think this really ties back to a broader discussion of multi-tenancy, how to make multi-tenant DNS. And we've discussed this several times. I'm seeing basically two approaches. One is to make DNS servers per namespace, and one is to make shared DNS servers that discriminate based on the client address. Obviously, the latter has the possibility to be more efficient, but it's a little fragile because in Kubernetes, you can't necessarily rely on the client address. And I don't know where, I mean, that's just the basic trade-off here. I'm not sure what everybody's thinking about that.
Sorry, I was on mute again. I have complete sympathy with the idea. I don't know in my heart of hearts what the right implementation is yet. I thought I saw Bowie on here, and he's been driving a lot of the DNS lately. I'm going to sort of delegate the decision in the end to Bowie, or at least from our side. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, I think this is Bowie. That we are concerned about the resource usage because, as we discussed last time, you could have conceivably a ton of namespaces. So maybe it is possible to share the server or the caching layer in some sense. But I guess one thing that would be good is how much of it would be baked in versus sort of impact from a, force you to have multiple servers, one for each namespace or not.
The other thing that occurs to me is that if you allow overlapping IP addresses in your multi-tenancy implementation, you still can't rely on the IP address of the client. You'd need some kind of network or tenant identifier to differentiate along with the address. You're on mute, Mike.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so I completely agree. And I'm really divided too, because I'm looking at a lot of namespaces, but I'm also looking at overlapping IPs. So, yuck.
And with respect to the multi-network stuff, if we're allowing people to sort of go into the multi-network space, we got to make sure that DNS is resolvable and reachable from every reasonable network setup.
Well, from every pod, right?
Well, from every pod, which might be on disjoint networks, we got to make sure that the DNS that is appropriate for that pod is reachable by that pod.
At least one of the DNSs that's appropriate, yeah. Or precisely the one that gets configured is reachable. Well, one of the ones that gets configured.
Yeah, I mean, you could have multiple. Each network could supply a DNS server.
Up to the limit, of course. I read that there's actually a small limit that actually gets supported in the Linux kernel.
With glibc as your implementation, you get 3. If you write your own implementation, you can do as many as you want. If you have a caching forwarding DNS server like DNSMask, you can do as many as you want.
Right, but we're not in control of that, right? So we should.
It depends. You're in control of the containerized application. If you decide to replace glibc's DNS implementation with your own inside the container, then you can do whatever you want with as many DNS servers as you want, as long as you can reach those servers from the pod. It's just the glibc implementation and the resolve conf format inside the pod are limited to 3. Food for thought.
I'm not sure I understand, but is the choice of glibc, is that the application programmer's choice or the cluster operator's choice?
No, it's the image that your container is built on. So
that's the application programmer's choice.
Correct. If you happen to build your application with glibc, which a lot of containers are built with glibc because they're just built off, a Linux system or a Linux file system and programs, then you only get 3.
Right. So my point is, we want to be able to support a wide range of images. So we have to look at that.
Yeah, but I mean, what I mean is that if you have 5 networks and they all have DNS servers, and you have an application built using a DNS resolver that can deal with all 5 servers, then you're great. That's fine. But if you have 5 networks attached to a pod, and that pod has an image built from glibc as the base for the resolver, then you have to make a tough decision how many you actually get, because you get 3 of the 5.
Well, it also depends on what...
Sorry, yeah, I was going to say, just because you have multiple networks, it does not necessarily mean that you have multiple DNS servers. Right. You could still have your records in the same DNS server.
Yep.
That's definitely a possibility.
And also note that Go has its own DNS resolver. And so Go may not have this limitation. So, if you write something with Go, it may not apply. It's mostly for things that use the glibc resolver. But anyway, it's kind of a side point. Just something to think about.
Yeah.
Is that any more thoughts on that, or should we move on to multiple networks for the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, I don't. Unfortunately, I don't know if we can resolve it now, but I would like to make progress on it because we have been tossing this ball around.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the answer, usually when you can't decide, the answer is you punt and let someone else decide. So can we make this a choice that the cluster operator makes rather than we make?
Something that we had, or that I've wanted to do for a while that I know has come up in this group in the past, is to use DNS information returned from the CNI plugin. And if we end up having multiple networks, and in one case for multiple networks, running multiple CNI plugins per pod, each one of those plugins could return separate DNS info that Kubelet has to do something with. So, I mean, there's a potential conflict with the cluster policy there, because I think currently you can define a cluster DNS server and it's not specific to each pod or network. But maybe that's one place to start, is allowing the network plugin to provide DNS information and to actually somehow consume that inside the pod.
Yeah. Regarding that cluster config for the DNS, I think the correct interpretation of it is really this is a choice that the application programmer makes. And when he says nothing, it defaults to cluster config. And I think when he says nothing, what it really means is whatever the cluster operator wants. And if the cluster operator wants to actually pull the information from the CNI plugin, then that's a perfectly legitimate thing to happen, I think.
I would agree. Does that move the discussion forward at all?
It's part way, yes. So that's a way by which the cluster operator could choose either of two different DNS implementations, or potentially, let's just do it that way. Yeah, the cluster operator could choose whether he wants DNS servers per namespace or per cluster, and arrange that the CNI plugin returns the appropriate server DNS client configuration.
Do you mean per network or per namespace?
Well, let's start with where we are today, which is you've got one CNI plugin that gets invoked, right? Yep. So the cluster operator could arrange that CNI plugin returns the one DNS client config to inject into the pods. And in the future case where we go to multiple networks, each one of the CNI invocations can return optionally some DNS client configuration, and the kubelet needs to merge those together, hopefully not coming up with a list larger than 3, and put that into the pod.
Note that you can write many more to resolve.conf. It'll only use the top 3.
Right. And that's bad enough.
Yeah, note that the idea of having multiple DNS servers sounds very clever, but my experience with the implementations of the various resolver libraries is very unclear as to what it means if those servers return different information. Basically every design choice you can imagine has been made by one of the major libcs.
Right. I think my view is the purpose of that really is just that the reason there's a list of more than one is if the first one is down, you want to go to the second. So it's not about merging different answers. It's about alternatives to which to go to get the full.
I can definitely think of use cases where if you have different networks, different things are reachable on those different networks. And so each one of those servers might have a different set of information that it can reply for.
Well, as Tim just said, that's not the universal behavior of DNS clients.
Correct.
We can't do that.
It would be nice if that was how it worked.
Yeah, to do that properly, we'd have to insert a mux in between with a suffix match and know which server to ask for which suffix, which DNS mask does do, but we'd now be configuring it on a per pod basis.
Yeah.
So one of the things that bothers me is that it's possible for developers who are unfamiliar with this limitation in glibc to run into this problem and not know why it's breaking on them. Do you think it would be possible at all where if we detect that they're using glibc and injecting more than 3 DNS servers, we could stick a warning in Kubernetes saying more than 3, you should work out some different solution?
Yeah, there's I don't know if it's been filed as an issue, but we have discussed basically spitting out a warning if your resolve.conf ends up being nonsensical, which it is easy to make it into such a state.
But I think we may be going down a rat hole here because in the real world, outside Kubernetes, people already do have multi-homed devices, and they're not expecting miracles from their DNS client.
The way that most people would encounter this is if they have a VPN and that VPN has a different set of information than their upstream name server from their ISP. And so you do some kind of match on the name and direct a certain set of queries to the VPN server and the other set to the ISP.
I think in that case you would have to send all your DNS requests to the VPN, right?
No, you don't. You just match, anything for this set of addresses, star.foo.com goes to the VPN and everything else goes to the ISP, and you can have an arbitrary list of matches. It's usually implemented using a caching name server like DNS mask that just
so you need some other active component in there.
Yep, definitely. That's probably the most common use case for multi-homed DNS.
I see. So is there general consensus that extension via CNI looks like a way forward here?
I think that would be useful, and maybe that's just the start.
Whether it's literally through CNI or whether it's through what other network description mechanism that we use, we're running out of time. We have run out of time for Joji's topic, but there will be some description of networks, and maybe it fits there, or maybe it fits in CNI. But yeah, if we're looking at this as a per tenant thing or a per network thing, then clearly there's a coupling.
For multiple networks, should we try to continue the call for a little bit, or should we take the discussion back to the mailing list? I feel like we've had some good discussion on the mailing list in the past week, so maybe that's acceptable. Otherwise, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit and talk.
I have to drop off, but I have done a poor job of recircling back to that doc. Joji, I send you my sincerest apologies. I'm going to try to make time for it now that the 1.6 release is essentially locked and loaded.
Yeah, no worries, Tim. Please take a look when you get a chance. And then we have actually made a lot of progress, I think, since you last looked at it. But if you can take a look at it and give any feedback, that will be really helpful.
I will do. Sorry.
Yeah. And then Dan, I'm okay either way. I think that's probably the only issue we have left at this point.
Although maybe, I think the use cases that Intel proposed today deserve a little bit more discussion too, since I think that in some ways rehashes some of the stuff that we previously settled. So maybe revisit some of that, or at least explain the reasoning for why we thought those were settled already, and open some of that up.
Right. We can do that. I'm thinking we probably don't have enough time to go over that right now.
Yeah.
Because I just looked at it before the meeting, so I didn't have enough time to do my homework on that. So that will have to be over the email or in the doc. But about the CNI interface that we talked about. So I looked at your proposal. I think so. First of all, do we want to stay on?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit.
Okay. So I think the only reservation I have about your proposal is it's a little bit more complicated than I would have liked. Having to explicitly call out some of these things through the CNI, it almost assumes that CNI never supported multiple networks. So it almost sounds like we are adding that to CNI in a way.
Can you explain that? I'm not sure what you mean by never supported multiple networks.
So if I look at the CNI network config, it sounds to me like intuitively, it sounds like it already has the concept of multiple networks. You can specify a network name.
Right.
In the config. So, if I want network A, I say network A, and if I want network B, I say network B. So that concept is already inherent in the CNI interface from what I can see. So now we are talking about explicitly calling out, multiple network capability in the CNI config. So that sounds a little, incorrect to me. So I was thinking we'll treat like the future, as the clean scenario, and for backwards compatibility, we will do the simplest approach is what I was thinking. So,
I think possibly the confusion there is that the specification might have been, or at least the common uses of CNI may have been towards the more thin plugin. So I'm very, what's the word for it? Interested to hear that interpretation because I had not thought about that particular aspect of it before. And most of the uses of CNI have been static config files on disk, and the name has mostly just been a human identifier that somebody sets. So,
that's what I figured.
And I can't think of why the spec in any way would deny that interpretation. So that might be an interesting way. The only reservation I had with auto-generating the configuration for a plugin was that then that precludes somebody from adding additional information to the configuration JSON that gets sent to the plugin. Because
it's based on a template.
Things have changed somewhat since then in the proposal.
Okay, I'm sorry, I haven't caught up with the latest proposal.
Yeah. So I guess, kind of reviewing what I had said in a mail, I feel like in my mind there's two different cases here: thin plugins and thick plugins is what I call them. And you can think of thin plugins as the existing CNI plugins like Bridge, IPVLAN, MacVLAN. Right. They're basically one shot. They are not particularly intelligent. They just consume configuration and they run and do their thing. Whereas what Joji is proposing are what I call thick plugins, where they can handle multiple networks internally themselves. And I'd imagine they probably talk to some controller, whether that's Neutron or something else or whatever. And so what I think Joji is proposing is that Kubelet would call the plugin and somehow pass the network name to the plugin. And then the plugin would take that network name and figure out all the other configuration information, subnet, IPAN details, tenant ID, that kind of thing. Does that make sense, Mike?
It's actually, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm done. Go ahead, Joji.
Yeah, no, so I was going to say, no, it's actually very, very similar to, I mean, I think the key difference is it's a cluster-wide configuration as opposed to like a host-specific configuration.
Yep.
It is actually quite similar to how the CNM does it too. It takes a network name as an argument from the user and passes it down to the driver. And you can pass other key values as opaque items, which we are saying we could do the same with annotations as key value pairs, although we don't necessarily push that down to the driver directly. So, your summary is accurate, Dan, as far as I can see. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess from my end, I'd like to think about it a little bit more.
Okay.
Given the information and some of the stuff you've talked about.
Right.
So I think this.
So let me ask you this. So in the thin plugin case, you're saying a static file is required because it might require additional configuration via that file.
Yeah, that's the way that things have traditionally worked for CNI, and the way that a lot of the node local stuff like KubeNet and the cloud providers that currently use KubeNet have worked. So
I see.
And you can think of, I mean, for example, maybe a cluster admin wants to do both a, Linux bridge for one network and a cluster-wide network for the other one for, maybe a local data plane of some kind.
Okay.
And then the cluster-wide one could be, a control plane network or some kind of management network. So I'm trying to keep some of the options open. Try to accommodate both types of plugins because I feel like that's useful, and I can think of some use cases, particularly around NFV perhaps, where that might be useful.
Right.
So I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from. I'm trying to keep the options open for both of those because I think they're useful.
Okay, so that sounds fine. So I think the key point here is we need a way to read the static config file from the disk and pass it along, and we need a way to bypass that in another scenario. And as long as we achieve those two modes of operation, and we have a way to keep that somewhat simpler, it should be okay, right?
Yeah, and I think, we don't have to do anything special to accommodate the thin plugin case. It's the thick plugin case. And one of my goals here is to try to make it, I guess, as streamlined as possible. And I know some of the proposals don't necessarily do that. But I was a little bit concerned that if Kubelet is generating a bunch of configuration and trying to exec plugins itself from that directory, that's not really going through CNI. I guess it's sort of using, the CNI interface. It just seemed a little, what's the word for it?
Okay.
Maybe a little less clear.
Okay.
But that's not to say that couldn't happen.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm not necessarily saying that we should auto-generate the config. We could, I'm fine with having one fixed file on every node, as long as we don't have to generate. I don't know where the noise is coming from. Okay, it looks okay now. Yeah, so as long as there is a way to create additional networks without having to go and change every single node, I think that's the goal.
Yep.
I'm trying to meet. Because especially with multiple networks, with single network, I think we could probably get away with having a file on every node. But with multiple networks, it could get complicated very quickly if you have to do that in certain scenarios, which is why I want to avoid that. But then I'm not saying necessarily that we have to auto-generate the config. We'll try to avoid that. So let me try to look at it a little bit more. And ideally, I would like something a little bit simpler than what you have proposed.
Sure.
So let me also look at that and see what we can do. But at least I understand the requirements at this point.
Yep. Yeah,
Right.
I think I need to also take a look at it too.
Okay.
Were there other comments? Somebody else is trying to talk, I think.
Plugin.
Yeah, who is this? Sorry.
Hi, this is Kural from Intel. I was looking the use case of Dan regarding the thin plugin and regarding the thick plugin. My idea was like you guys were planning for the network or network configuration reference. For example, if you have a CNI, you have network configuration parameters like bridge name or those details or IPAM information. Why can't we send those information as part of annotations? Like if you pass those information as part of annotations, it will be much easier, right? Why you guys thinking that we need to have those information in kind of files?
Yeah, so I think the main objection I had to that was that number one, that ends up locking things into a particular type of network plugin, basically CNI. And yeah, that's where we're going, and a decision was made a while back to concentrate on CNI. But with the rise of the remote runtimes, it's not guaranteed that those remote runtimes will use CNI. And anybody could write their own runtime, and that doesn't have to use CNI. So it seemed a little odd to me that locking in a particular configuration syntax into the Kubernetes API, more or less, that didn't quite seem the right thing to do. But then the second thing is that would basically be an opaque blob of data, because not all network plugins would care about that configuration, and there wouldn't be anything interesting that Kubernetes could really do with it, because only certain plugins would even use the CNI configuration for IPAM or any of the other attributes. Especially in the thick plugin case, most of those plugins handle IPAM themselves, and that does not go through Kubernetes at all. So I think those were the two biggest reservations I had about storing configuration in the Kubernetes API itself. Does it make any sense? I mean, I don't want to shut that discussion down at all. I'm just trying to, work through some of that and bring up some of the issues we talked about previously.
Yeah, the other problem with having the configurations sent from the orchestrator is that different use cases and different plugins will require different configuration, right? So it's kind of hard to standardize on a given configuration. So that is the other issue that we always run into whenever we try to push down config from the top for everything.
I mean, that said, it does bring up an interesting question of if you do decide, and I think maybe this is partly the Intel use case, if you do decide to use what I've been calling thin plugins, but you want to dynamically compose networks using thin plugins, then how do you do that without installing config files on every node when a new network is created? Is that a response to the question, Mike? Okay.
It's just getting late. I think I have to go.
Okay. All right. All good points. I mean, let's not shut this discussion.
One quick suggestion. Have we looked at config map as an option for storing the configuration information?
kube config map?
Yeah, I don't think we have. I think it's not about how the information gets stored. It's whether the information is appropriate to be stored at all. At least that's where I'm coming at it from. So if we decide that it is appropriate to store it inside the Kube API, then config map might be the way to do it. But I think we have to answer that larger question first.
This is David from Intel. We caused our one a phase one approach because as people are getting at is there's a lot of scope here. So it might be best just to maybe start with the TIG lines and then think about maybe the TIG lines later on. You're just making a lot of hassle up front and not really getting anywhere with it. So maybe this is a suggestion.
That's true. And, I think if we move forward with the existing network proposal, that doesn't preclude some other approaches and additions later. What I think we've tried to do with the multi-network proposal that exists, if you guys don't have a link to that document, we can certainly send one around again. I think there's a link in the agenda notes as well. But it tries to be as simple as possible and as common a base as possible so that every plugin can work with it, and so that we can try to get things into Kubernetes rather than continuously bike shed about them. So maybe we just start there and then we keep discussing on how to enhance it going forward.
Sure, yep, sounds good.
Okay, and I guess, David, if you and the rest of the team there could take a look at that proposal and see if it precludes anything that you guys would like to do, that would be useful information.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well. If there is anything that's preventing you from, implementing your use case,
yep.
Definitely like to understand and do what we can to accommodate your use case.
Definitely.
Yeah. I'd just say maybe 30 seconds there on that. So we actually have 3 phases in this, and what we described as phase 1 is really just kind of get the multiple overlay networks to work. Most of our use cases for our customers are actually in the phase 2 area, which is the physical network, all these things like SRV, DPDK, and all these things. Now, we didn't share with you the phase 2 because it's just going to create too much hassle at this point. So what we're trying to just try to create a phased approach, and just maybe just start with this, and we can build on top of from there on. So I don't think we're introducing anything new to you guys in phase 1 and what we put up on the document. And we just want to work better with you to get to a better place after phase 1, and we have some basic functionality in place.
Yeah, I think we want the same thing. All right, let's continue discussion on the list and in the Google Doc then.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
All right, that's it for this week. Thanks, everybody. See you in 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.